Hello. I'm very happy to introduce. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Laura Millar. Laura is an independent consultant and scholar in records, archives, and information management, and she has also worked in publishing and distance education. She has a Master of Archival Studies degree from the University of British Columbia and a doctorate from UCL. Her thesis on the concept of total archives provided a historical overview of acquisition practices in Canadian archives. Over the course of her career, Laura has consulted with governments, universities, professional and nonprofit organizations, and other agencies around the world. Her work has ranged from advising the government of Hong Kong on best practices in records and archives management to consulting with First Nations communities on the preservation of Indigenous sources of evidence. She has helped the United Nations develop record-keeping training and awareness-raising tools, and she spent 2 summers working with the Yukon Council of Archives to coordinate community archives activities across the Canadian North. She has also taught archives and records management in several universities in Canada, including a stint here as visiting professor a couple of years ago, as well as internationally. Laura's book, Archives, Principles and Practices, won the Society of American Archivists 2011 Waldo Gifford Leyland Award, and she's a 2-time recipient of the Association of Canadian Archivists W.K. Lamb Prize for articles she published in Archivaria. Her new book, A Matter of Facts, The Value of Evidence in an Information Age, has just been published, and it is the subject of her talk this evening. I should have done that. We should have a van and white walking across. We've asked Laura to talk for about 55 minutes, after which we will open the floor for questions. So please join me now in welcoming Laura Millar.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to stand up just momentarily so you can all see me in the back. But I have got a current non-life-threatening but really annoying eye problem, which means I have to wear the glasses and see the script. So in order to be able to make sure I stay focused, I need to sit. And I apologize for that because I prefer to be just dancing around the room. But at this point, if I do that, I'll break my neck and that will be really ugly. So I am down here. I will try to speak as loudly as possible. And I thank you for coming and being here and welcoming me. What I want to do is talk to you about the origins of writing this book. What do I say in this book? What are some of the arguments that I articulate and stories that I tell? And then end with a bit of commentary, as you will see, for the archival world. And then open the floor for discussions and questions and feedback and comments. I'm going to start by asking a question, and I can't see the answer, but how many people here work in, are studying, have worked in, or are trained in the field of records, archives, information management, broadly defined? How many people are civilians? Not in the world.
Oh.
No.
And I'm a civilian.
But not working in the world of records, information, archives, haven't studied it, this is not your place. Lisa, this book is for you.
Perfect.
This book is written for the public. This is not written for the profession. And that's really important because my motivation for writing it is deep and it is born out of an enormous sense of frustration. So let me just start. 5:06, I got my marching orders. 6 o'clock, I stopped. Shut up. Okay. Truth matters, facts matter, evidence matters more. That's a rather bold statement, but I am prone to bold statements. I was approached by the Society of American Archivists probably 3 years ago. Would I be interested in writing a book for the general public? Now, I've written a lot for the profession, and I was kind of tired of writing for the profession. The profession was moving on, and I didn't really want to stay up with the literature, and I thought, I think I've done my bit. It's time for me to ride off on my horse and go away. But they said you could write for the public, and I said, well, that sounds intriguing. What would I write? And they said, well, how about a how-to book on how to manage your own archives? And I thought, I'll think about it. So I was thinking about it, and I happened to be in Australia with my husband, and we were parking our car at a little whistle stop in Australia, and he was checking into the hotel, and I had the local radio on, and he came out and I was in tears. And he said, "What happened?" And I said, "Donald Trump is the president of the United States of America." And he said, I won't repeat what he said. And I thought, okay, we have just seen an election period fraught with danger, filled with lies, alternative facts, manipulated story, threats of fake news. Who needs a book on how to manage your own records in that world? If my time on this earth is limited, is that how I want to spend my time? I was really angry. Now, I have to say that part of the reason I was angry is that I am an American-born child of Canadian parents who lived up into my teenage years in the United States. And I still have a foot in both camps, even though I've lived in Canada since I was a teenager, and I also lived in England. I like to think of myself as a global citizen, but in some ways, I was suddenly reminded that I had this attachment to a country that I was very concerned about. So I went back to the Society of American Archivists and I said, I'll write you a book, but it's not going to be the one you asked for. It's going to be the one I want to write. And the one I want to write is what I have been beating my head against the wall for my 35 years career as a consultant, which is trying to convince the people in the boardroom that they need to care about evidence, that they need to care about archives and records and data, and that if they don't, there is peril ahead. And to their credit, they said, okay, she's got her dander up, okie dokie, go with it. And so we arranged a co-publishing arrangement with the American Library Association, signed a contract, started researching and writing the book, and have spent the last years, I finished writing it in December of 2018, but in fact I had to do a big rewrite because the Millar report came out in April of 2019, and I had to read the whole Millar report and then put it into the book in a week. That was challenging. So I said, okay, I'm going to write this book, and I'm going to write this book for the public, and I'm going to tell them what I think, and I'm going to try to convince them of the value of evidence. Now, you're all saying, what does she mean by evidence? I will tell you what I mean by evidence, but not right away. So I have written this book. There are many chapters. What I try to do is unfold a story for a general public that says, let me take you into my world and tell you what's going on here and try to engage you. So it is filled to the brim with stories and anecdotes and cases. And there is, with about 6 exceptions, nary an archival quotation in sight. Right there, this is not a book for archivists. I am not drilling down into the details of our profession. I am sure I'll get lots of criticism from people who say, you didn't talk about blah, 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 blah. And I say, the general public doesn't care about blah, 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 blah. So I'm not talking to them about that. So the first thing I talk about in the book is that we live in a world of enormous volumes of data. And I talk about volume, velocity, and veracity. And I say the problem in our world is that we are generating massive amounts of data, and it's moving at the speed of light. And how do we know that it's trustworthy? How can we trust in a post-trust world? How can we trust in a post-truth world? And I cite this example. This is where I have to do the reading. There's a technology expert named Bernard Marr who has studied how much data gets generated around the world. And he has every day 16 million text messages, 156 million emails, 1 trillion photographs every day. So I added that up. He said it was 2.5 quintillion bytes of data. And I don't know what a quintillion is. I have no idea. I panicked. And I actually called up some friends of mine. I've got a friend who has a physics degree and a friend who's a computer scientist. I said, help me with the math here. Let's figure out the math. And what I had done is said, how can I make this understandable to the public how much this is? And somebody had been talking about the Hubble telescope. And I found out that the Hubble telescope transmits data back to Earth at 910 gigabytes a year. So 910 gigabytes a year will get sent from the Hubble telescope back to Earth. And then I took that 2.5 quintillion bytes of data. And I said, that is 912.5 billion gigabytes of data. And my friends did the math. And we said, if we took our 912.5 billion gigabytes of data and sent it back to Earth, that's 1 year's worth of data, send it back to Earth using the Hubble telescope, it would take 1 billion years, 1 million millennia, 10 million centuries. And that's for 1 year's worth of the data we generate on Earth. Now, my physics friend said, well, Laura, that's a really bad example. And I said, why? And he said, because the Hubble telescope's old and it's slow and we can go faster. And I said, thank you. And I went home and I thought about it and I thought about it. And as some people know, I have been pulling up examples, metaphors around the environmental movement and around recycling and around reduce, reuse, recycle. How can we take these concepts into the world of evidence? And I thought, yeah, we got faster technology. We also got more powerful cars. We got bigger engines in our cars. We got more gas consumption in our cars. Was that really a good idea? Not really. So the question that I start with is, we're generating all of this stuff. Some of it is evidence. A whole lot of it is not evidence. You, the public, need to understand the difference because we cannot manage this anymore. So from that premise, I then take them through what is evidence, what is the difference between evidence and data and information, why is it valuable, and what do we do about it? And in there is also, what are the misplaced assumptions about evidence? So that's sort of the structure of the book, but I begin not with talking about evidence, but talking about truth. And I say we live in a post-truth age, which Oxford Dictionary has defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion or personal belief. Stephen Colbert called it truthiness. So I talk about what is this idea of truth? What is this post-truth world that we live in? And I will say that this builds on the discussions around postmodernism, which I would say are fascinating academic discussions, but I quote in the book Lee McIntyre, who is a philosopher of science, and he teaches in Boston. And he actually wrote the foreword to my book, which was just a thrill for me. And in his book, Post-Truth, which is an excellent analysis of concept of truth in a post-truth world, he says, it's all fun and games to attack truth in the academy, but what happens when one's tactics leak out into the hands of science deniers and conspiracy theorists or thin-skinned politicians who insist that their instincts are better than any evidence? And this is the world we're living in. We are living in a world where that man can say truth isn't truth, and it's national news. Rudy Giuliani talking to Chuck Todd, Chuck Todd, about whether or not Donald Trump would testify in front of the Millar inquiry, and Giuliani is saying, well, he shouldn't because you're just going to challenge him on the truth. And he's not going to tell the truth, so we wouldn't worry. It's silly. It's only his version of the truth is not the truth. And then when he's pressed, he comes back with truth isn't truth. Right? Everybody flies back in their seat and they say truth isn't truth. And I listened to this and I thought about it really hard and I thought, you know what, he's right. Truth isn't truth. So I start the book by positioning the question of truth. What is truth? What are facts? And what is evidence? And it's in many ways a very philosophical discussion. True does not mean accurate. True is loyal, faithful, devoted. True can be partial, it can be relative, it can be personal. So I love the color purple. That's true. It's true I love the color purple. Some people love Game of Thrones. Some people love Downton Abbey. That is their truth. And of course, never the twain shall meet, right? There are partial truths. Somebody says, He's only been married once, but he's lived with 5 people for multiple lengths of time in intimate relationships. Is he telling the truth? Yeah, he was only married once, but that's a partial truth. So where is the truth in that statement? I cite in the book Bill Clinton's "I did not have sex with that woman."
Sexual relations.
Sexual relations, thank you very much. I have shortcut it here. Sexual relations. What does that mean? Is it true? He says it's true. You know, it's a very narrow Old Testament version of truth, right? One of the examples I cite in the book is the height of Mount Everest. Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth. It's true that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth. Well, it is if you measure from sea level to the summit. So it's 8,848 meters above sea level. But if we measure from the floor bottom of the ocean, then Mauna Kea in Hawaii is taller. It's 10,200 meters, but only 4,200 are above the ocean. So what's true? What's the truth in there? And as I say in the book, I said there's a relative truth about the name itself. We call in Canada, we call it Mount Everest, but it's called Sagarmatha in Nepali and Chomolungma in Tibetan. What's the true name? Where's the truth in that? So I articulate these ideas, and then I say, there is a kind of truth that should be true, and that's an evidence-based truth. There should be an ability to base a truth on facts. And the example that I use, and I find a useful example because I'm a West Coaster where it rains all the time, is say I see a puddle on the ground. Does it mean it rained? Is it true that it rained? Is it raining right now? Well, if I see raindrops falling right now, and I know, and we agree what a raindrop is, and say you see a raindrop, I see a raindrop, it's true that it's raining. Okay, it's raining. I see a puddle, does that mean it rained yesterday? Or does it mean that the radiator in my car leaked, or that the dog didn't get out to the grass in time? What does this puddle mean? What is true? So what we need is an accumulation of facts in order to prove the truth. We have rain all over the car, we have puddles on the ground. It is true that it rained. We can agree that it rained. What if you see an accumulation of 25 feet of snow in your front yard? You say, I have 25 feet of snow in my front yard, there is no such thing as climate change. Because there's no global warming because look at all this snow. Well, the snow is a fact, absolutely. But the United Nations Climate Change Panel has better facts. They have scientific evidence. They have data analysis. They have core samples. They can say there is global warming and we have a climate crisis. And the person who has 25 feet of snow in their yard has a diminished sense of facts and a diminished sense of evidence in comparison with that larger accumulation of facts. So I try to set all this up in the book to say an evidence-based truth, as opposed to a personal truth or a relative truth or a qualitative truth, is a conclusion or perspective reached as a result of the analysis of an accumulation of facts. Facts are statements that can be proven by an analysis of available evidence. And evidence is any source of information that provides demonstrable proof. So this phone is an object. I could say this is a phone and it's a fact because we have agreed what we call a phone and we have agreed that this fits the definition. So the fact is this is the phone. The phone is not the fact, the phone is the evidence, right? So we need evidence in order to substantiate our facts, which then give us an evidence-based truth. Now, having got there, people say, what kind of evidence? Well, there's archaeological evidence, physical evidence, anthropological, traditional, hearsay, scientific. There are many different kinds of evidence in the world. So I take the reader from there and say, I'm talking to you primarily about a particular type of evidence. I am talking to you about recorded evidence, which I define as information that has been fixed in space and time and can be verified as authentic so that it serves as proof. And I also go into detail about what is the difference between data and information and evidence. And then I come back and say, they are not the same. but in fact, data can serve as evidence. And sometimes yes, sometimes no. So there's a lot of but. So I talk in the book about recorded evidence. What I am trying to do is draw the reader into the world of records and archives and data with evidential value without tricking them by using the word archives at the beginning. Because if I do, they're going to go, ugh, that's old stuff. I am trying to dispel the idea that it's old stuff. So I'm going to come back later to the question of what is authentic recorded evidence and how do we determine what it means. I'll talk more about different types of evidence. But what I want to say here is truth matters, but only if we can trust it. Facts matter, but only if we have enough of them. So evidence matters more, particularly in this age where we have people standing up using digital technologies to give us lies. And many of us don't see it. We look past it. We see our Twitter feed and we think it's true. Without authentic and reliable evidence, we cannot verify the facts and we cannot establish the truth. The more evidence we have, the better our truths. The new evidence that comes, the newer the truths. One of the stories I tell in the book is around Donald Trump's inauguration ceremony and the claim by Sean Spicer before he started wearing lime green shirts and which is just frightening in itself. Him saying it was the biggest inauguration ever. So I go through the whole thing and I say, okay, he's claiming it's the biggest inauguration ever. Is it true? And I analyze the whole thing and then I come back to it at the end of that chapter and I say, well, where's the evidence? And I find the evidence of the Washington Transit Authority transit usage for that day. And I find the photographs that have been analyzed by journalists and evidence experts. And I say, they have analyzed all of this evidence and they have said, no, this is not true. And as I was writing this part of the book, and then I put it away and I come back to it, this new story came out of the Guardian newspaper in the UK that said somebody had reanalyzed by virtue of an FOI request, had gained access to White House records that proved that indeed, as Sean Spicer had said, the photographs had been manipulated. The photographs showing the inauguration had been manipulated to try to show something different. They'd been manipulated at the order of Sean Spicer in order to change the truth about the size of the inauguration. More evidence, more facts, better truth, which is one of the reasons we don't just need evidence, we need accumulations of evidence over time, which then takes us to we need archives, because archives are evidence that is living through time and space so that it remains there for us to use today, tomorrow, 100 years from now. So having all of that in the book, I was then compelled to think, how do I convince people now that this matters? So having laid the groundwork for what are archives, and I've skipped now a chapter on what is evidence, because I'm going to come back to that in my talk. But in the book, I say, let me tell you what I mean by evidence. What are the different forms of evidence? I'll come back to that, because that's more fun. We can have that later. I then have chapters that say, why does evidence matter? Do you care? And I look at it in terms of three things. I look at it in terms of accountability, justice, and rights, human rights. I look at it in terms of identity and connection, and I look at it in terms of memory and narrative. So I have chapters on each of these. So accountability, justice and human rights, identity and sense of connection, and memory and narrative. And I just want to talk a little bit about a couple of the stories that I tell in the book. So when I talk about accountability, I have stories about government, holding governments accountable for their actions. There are quite a few stories about Donald Trump in the book. I talk about the Icelandic economic crisis and how evidence was pivotal in coming to justice with that. About the Hillsborough football disaster in the UK and how evidence played a role. About Kobe Steel in Japan falsifying records to show that they were building steel products that were in fact not strong enough, but they doctored the records. About Westpac in Australia not managing their banking records adequately. So in writing this book, I was combing the media all the time. I was not reading in the archival literature as much as reading the news, which left me really depressed, kind of overwhelmed, and dreading my Twitter feed every morning. This particular story relates to children in cages. Now, I wrote this story a year ago. And when I was starting to write this story a year ago, the story was that the US government, Department of Homeland Security, was violating the Federal Records Act by failing to create adequate records of immigrant parents and children. They'd adopted a zero-tolerance policy regarding asylum seekers in April of 2018, and I'm writing this about a month later. And so US government officials were stopping people at the border. And if they came as a family group, before that, they would have been kept as a family group, and there was a more lenient way of managing them. The government didn't want to do this anymore. So they said if they arrived at the border without a visa, they'd be charged with criminal entry, and the children would be removed from their parents' custody and put in detention centers, shelters, or foster homes. This was the story at the time. The parents would be jailed or they would be deported. Now, there's an organization called Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, or CREW, and they issued a lawsuit. And they said that the government had a haphazard approach to record keeping, which had catastrophic consequences for the immigrants affected. It's saying, rarely, if ever, has an agency's violation of its statutory record-keeping obligations had such grave implications. And I drilled down as much as I could into what was actually happening, bearing in mind I could not get any records of Homeland Security without doing access requests, and I was not in a position to be able to do that. So I was relying on secondary sources and news articles. What happened was when the families came to the border guards would document them. They'd give them a number, they would register them, and then they would say, now you're going over here, parents, and you children are going over here. The children would be moved and they would be given a file number, a case number. Parents would be given a file number pending deportation. Border security would say, we've done our job. We don't need our number anymore. And they would get rid of it. So now you have one number, two number, three numbers, records attached to all those numbers. The linking number is gone. The linking records are gone because we finished our job. We've done our job. They're over there. We don't have to worry about them anymore. So CREW is suing and is still suing Department of Homeland Security to say this is wrong. Now, when I wrote that story, the suggestion was the children were going into very lovely foster homes. This is a drawing of one of the children of what is it like to be in a cage. And what we are learning now, new evidence, new truths, is they were not going into those foster homes. A lot of them were going into detention centers and into camps. Now, this is the issue in there that comes up throughout my research, and I was just talking to Fern, wonderful Fern, about this over a cup of tea a little while ago, is the job of the record keeper is to protect the evidence, to support accountability, justice, rights, identity, connection, memory, and narrative. That is what we do. That is our job. I believe that passionately. But where do we cross the line to saying, I'm not even going to let you do this in the first place? And I don't have an answer for that, but I raised the question of, if I were sitting there holding the records of the child and watching them being marched off, I would desperately want to make sure I had that record so I had accountability, but I would also desperately want to stop that child from going there and their parents from going there. So this is the eternal struggle that I have in the book, is trying to say to people, you have to care about the evidence, because if people are not going to behave with honor and integrity, we have to hold them to account. But we also have to think about, where do we cross the line in that? What do we do? I don't have an answer, but if we start having a conversation, I welcome that conversation. So I have a chapter that gives examples of the importance of evidence for accountability and justice and rights. I have another chapter that talks about identity and connection. I talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. I talk about Aboriginal children being removed from their homes in Australia. I talk about the records of slavery in the United States. I talk about care leavers in Australia and the United Kingdom. I talk about the use of the government apology in Canada for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was intended to uncover the truth about the schools. They're not uncovering the truth, they're uncovering the evidence that supports the facts that can be used to come up with evidence-based truths. So we have to watch when we use this word truth, because we need to be very careful that it is a shortcut to many things. And what I articulate in the book is we need to look at an evidence-based truth that we can actually hold up and say, you can't lie about this because I have the proof. So part of the TRC work in Canada was to gather documentary evidence in order to support the search for justice. And without that evidence, we would not have achieved anything like the justice we're working to achieve now. When I talk about evidence, memory, and narrative, I am talking about what do we want to remember and what do we need to remember? How do we interpret ourselves, and what is the evidence that we use in order to interpret that? I tell a story of where I was when Kennedy was shot. I tell a story at the beginning of that chapter of being in my parents' bedroom and hearing the news over the radio and watching my mother fall in a heap and cry. I was 4 years old. I don't remember anything. I remember the family stories of where were you when. It is my truth that I was alive and I was present and I heard the news when Kennedy was assassinated. But it is only by seeing the evidence, such as Zapruder's film of the assassination, that we can say, I can remember. I can remember that, even though we don't remember. So what is the role of evidence in giving us a memory? And this story is one of my favorite and one of the sort of most distressing and uplifting. There is a story of a series of British Army films that were made during the Second World War. They were called Calling Blighty, the Calling Blighty series of films produced between 1944 and 46. And they showed Army personnel stationed in India, Burma, Malaya, and other locations, and they were greeting their families back home. There were 400 films produced. Only 64 are known to have survived. 40 were found in the basement of the town hall in Manchester in the 1980s. When workmen were cleaning up, they found the films tucked in a corner. Along with those canisters of films were the names and addresses of families who had been contacted to come to the screenings during the war. So they grouped people together by where they lived at home. You're from Manchester, all the Manchester folk come together. We'll record you standing there in Burma. You'll have 20 seconds to say hi to your family. And then we'll go and send that to Manchester. We'll show the film and we'll tell everybody, your uncle, your brother, your father is on this, come to the show. These names and addresses were on the canisters, which were in the basement when they were found. Channel 4 in the UK produced a documentary about this. And among the relatives who were contacted for a screening in the 1980s, many years after this, actually it was 2015, they contacted people in 2015 to a screening of these films which had been found in the 80s. It was a woman named Anne Alsop. That's her father there, John Hartley. He's in issue 149, and he says, sending best wishes to Mildred, mother and dad, and chirping, trust you all well, I am in the people. And about 3 or 4 weeks later, he was killed. And his daughter never met him. She never knew him. Her mother destroyed all the evidence of him, married the stepfather, gave her her stepfather's name, and that was it. She's in this room hearing his voice for the very first time. Sorry. And that's evidence, and that matters. And I write about that because I want people to care. So, having got you with that little story, I talk about the assumptions we make that endanger the evidence. And what do we do about those assumptions? How do we protect evidence in this post-truth age? First thing we have to do is get rid of these assumptions that we have. And I talk about these assumptions in the book. The first one, which is very early on in the book, is that we have an assumption about what we mean about evidence. are we talking about? Archives? Sure, archives. Archives is a subset of evidence. It's old, it's physical, it's static. Records are new, and they're utilitarian, and they're bureaucratic. And data is digital and dynamic and personal. But evidence is a social construct. We define evidence to suit our needs. And I grew up and studied archives where I lived in a world, a Western world, of this is what evidence means. And as I started working in different communities and internationally and in Canada, I said, wait a minute, this is not what evidence means. There are many different ways of interpreting evidence, and we need to understand those. And we need to understand when we can deal with them collectively and when they are going to butt into each other, which is what things happen. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of the butts in Canada was the Indigenous communities were saying, your definition of evidence is not my definition of evidence. So what are we going to do about that, folks? So I talk about the different types of evidence and how do we decide legally and through jurisdictional decisions and through regulatory decisions or through personal decisions, what is evidence and what is not. I talk about the quipu, which is a series of knots on a string that was used as evidence in the Andes in the 1500s, 1100 to 1500 AD. It's called talking knots. Each knot represents a piece of information. But we don't know what that means because there's nobody here to tell us. We know it was used as evidence, but we don't know what it means. We've lost that story. Cave art is evidence. And there's a fascinating study. Paleoanthropologist Genevieve von Petzinger has studied cave paintings in Europe. She's identified 32 graphic symbols, circles, lines, spirals, so on, 32 symbols that she has seen all around caves in Europe that are the same. Now, these people were not getting into their Subarus and driving from France to Germany, right? How did we get all these similar symbols in caves all around Europe? She thinks it's a form of language. She thinks it's a form of record. But we don't know what it means. We don't know because there's nobody here to tell us. So I talk about these. I talk about oral traditions, about songs and stories, and say within their communities, those are evidence. But what do we do if we take them into a different cultural context, a different social context? Are they still evidence? How do we deal with this intersection of evidence from different cultures? And even more pressing than the quipu is facial recognition technology, which is generating evidence that is being captured without our permission. Twitter, my God, government policy is being issued by Twitter every day. It's usually about 5 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday after Fox News broadcast is finished. Emojis that is the cave art of 2019. We are now communicating in symbols again. I am giving you my happy face and it is meaning something. But what's going to happen if we know what it means? Do we know what is the difference between my little happy face with hearts and my little happy face without hearts? Am I going to be held accountable for that? Databases, I talk about data as having evidential value and say it looks like an aggregate piece of data. It looks like a single piece of data in a database, but when we bring it together and aggregate it, it can provide evidence. And I go in depth into the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal and the Millar report, which is why I had to read the whole bloody thing. And I will tell you, if anybody here wants a fabulous PhD dissertation, it is look at the record-keeping implications that are articulated in the Millar report. It is one great big record-keeping exercise. The use of metadata and the fact that the investigative team looked at the loss of metadata in the capture of records and said, we cannot prove that this record was generated at this point because it was bulk transferred to another system and all the metadata that would have given us that context is gone. And I actually quote Millar, who says in the report, while this report embodies factual and legal determinations that the office believes to be accurate and complete to the greatest extent possible, the office cannot rule out the possibility that the unavailable information would shed additional light on or cast a new light on the events described in the report. And what I think about when I read that report is the defense of, well, I don't know, I was really drunk at the time. Diminished responsibility. Is it acceptable to allow diminished responsibility because of poor record keeping? I say no. So I try in this book as gently as possible to say, this cannot be considered acceptable behavior. It is not enough to say we had a bad record keeping system. But I will say it is beyond a bad record keeping system because it is willful. And in the Millar report, it talks about a very important exchange with Donald Trump and his lawyer, where he is saying to McGahn, the lawyer says, they sit down and they're trying to decide how to deal with this Millar report. This is in the obstruction of justice section. And he says, why are you taking notes? Lawyers don't take notes. And McGahn says, well, keeping a record is not a bad thing. And Trump says, no lawyer I ever had keeps notes. I don't know why you're keeping notes. Don't keep notes. Which, of course, becomes part of the record because McGahn has to testify and say, this is what I was told. So we make an assumption then, when we talk about the first assumption is we know what we mean by evidence. The next assumption is that evidence just exists. It just is. It's born, it lives, it's a byproduct of what we do, and it is natural and inevitable, and it's there, fine, no problem. That is not true. It is not always created in the first place, it is not always managed appropriately, and it does not always survive to the point where we need it. The next assumption that I talk about is that it is safe and accessible in perpetuity. This is the fire at the National Museum in Brazil. And I write about this fire and I talk about the implications of this. I talk about a story in Japan where the Japanese government was deliberately obscuring the titles of records because they did not want to have to answer FOI requests. So the title would be miscellaneous or documents concerning a conference, which meant that when the FOI request came in, they'd say, well, I'm sorry, we don't have any file titles that match. We don't have to answer that. And it's too much trouble. It's just easier to do this, and then we don't have to deal with this external problem of people wanting information from us. But the head of the Records Management Society of Japan, to their credit, challenged them and said, this is unacceptable. You cannot do this. Which parenthetically is something that I think we in our professional associations need to be doing, is challenging these situations. Another assumption, everything can be digitized. Easy. Now, I go into great depth. I talk about the Canadian Expeditionary Force files that have been digitized by Library and Archives Canada. And again, I did the math, right? I did a little bit of math around that, which was that it took 4 years to digitize the 622,000 files. Library and Archives Canada said it was 40 people full-time for 4 years to do that. If they had one person, it would have taken 163 years to do the job. And then I got a report from the UK-based Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals, and they've estimated it costs 40 to 50 cents a page to digitize normal paper documents and $4 to $17 per image to digitize photographs. And that includes all the quality control and metadata management and description. I then said, okay, if you digitize the photographic collection of the National Archives in Washington, 25 million photographs currently in their collection, at an average cost of $10 per image, because I'm so bad at math, I needed zeros at the end, right? I can't do a 7. There's a 7, I can't do it. I figured 25 million photographs, $10 an image is $250 million. Now, the annual expenditures for NARA in 2017 were $400 million. So they got 400 million in their pot. They're going to spend 250 million to digitize some photographs. It's not going to happen. So I say several times in the book, I say, it's not going to happen. We're not going to digitize everything. We shouldn't digitize everything, and we can't digitize everything. So get over it. And the other thing I say, which may make you happy, is I say, it is not dusty. It is not hidden, and it is not lost. It is waiting for you to come and find it. And all you got to do is read the finding aid. So please, people, stop saying it's hidden and lost and dusty. Another assumption I talk about in the book, technology is the solution. Technology is going to solve everything. I tell several stories about computer viruses and malware and how they have crashed and burned systems all around the world. I talk particularly about the NotPetya attack, which hit Ukraine and which completely collapsed the shipping company of Maersk. And if you really want a great read on that, there's a Wired article, or magazine Wired has an article about that particular case and the way they actually were able to salvage the corrupted data from this virus, which hit all of Maersk's computers around the world. Now, this is a shipping company. They've got ships moving all around the world, and suddenly everything crashes. They have no idea where their ships are, no idea where their containers are, or where their product is that they have to get to their customers. It's all gone. What they had to do was find the one company in West Africa, one Maersk office, that had not turned on its computer that morning, and called them and said, do not turn on that computer. Don't. Disconnect it from the internet, take out the hard drive, and sit there. And then they had to fly somebody down, and they were trying to fly the people out, and they couldn't get visas to get out. So they flew somebody down, and they met them at the border, handed over, flew them back to London, and said, we've now got the only uncorrupted hard drive left that will get us back. And as I say in the book, if we are going to be dependent for our consumer livelihood and our evidence and our civil rights on whether or not somebody turns the power on this morning, we've got to think really hard about whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. So having cheered you all up enormously, I do talk in the book about what to do about it. Now, I am talking to the public when I talk about this. I'm not talking to the professionals. And I say to the public, we need better laws. We need better legislation, better regulations. Not only do we need laws that strengthen evidence management, but we need to get to grips with, we call it data in one place, we call it information in another place, and we call it evidence in another place. Are we talking about the same thing? How do these laws intersect with each other? How do these regulations intersect with each other if we aren't even going to use the same words and we don't know what words we mean? What is the difference between data and information and evidence? I say we need increased enforcement and penalties for non-compliance. We need to make it a serious offense to violate record-keeping requirements. It's not a slap on the wrist. We also have to recognize the difference between legislating accountability in the public sector and the need to protect personal rights. And the right, not only the personal rights of people whose evidence is in somebody else's computer, but also the right of people as human beings to do what they want. I want people to value their evidence and care about it and value their archives, but it is their choice if they want to burn it. It's their choice. But in the public sector, I don't believe it should be a choice. It must be a requirement that you work for the people, you must be accountable for your actions. So I call for improved data privacy legislation. I call for duty to document legislation. I look at the GDPR model in Europe and the California laws, which have flaws. But I say, here is a place to start building a better regulatory structure for evidence management. I also talk about regulating third-party providers. I talk briefly about it because I don't really have an answer, but what I point out is Facebook is worth $140 billion. Google is worth $100 billion. Apple is worth $1 trillion. These are not public utilities, but we are treating them like public utilities. We think they just ought to exist and that they're going to manage our evidence and that putting it on Facebook is putting it out there for the world and it's safe. And there is no reason we should argue. I tell the story of Flickr. Flickr changed its regulations around the storage of photographs, and they said, we will keep the first 1,000 photographs without a charge, but after that, we're going to charge you. People were furious. They were furious. Who do you think you are? This is a corporate abandonment, they said. Corporate abandonment. And I was reading the news articles and I was reading the comment section, and people were saying, you're only letting me have 1,000. What do I do with the other 40,000 that I have in my collection? And of course, I'm thinking, who the hell has 40,000 photographs? Come on, folks. Can we not do a little bit of weeding here? So there's a question of, is it corporate abandonment or is it buyer beware? So do we need to regulate these bodies? Are they publishers? Are they information disseminators? Are they neutral platforms? We have to ask those questions, and we have to figure out some way to do it, but we have to stop thinking of them as perpetually existing public utilities that just sit there and quietly do what we want. Facebook was no way quiet about interfering with election activities in the UK or the US, so we have got to stop thinking about that. So then I talk about ethics, and I say we need to have ethical frameworks. I talk about journalism, history, statisticians, and archivists, and I say we all have ethical frameworks for our work. And civil servants have a code of public practice, which is an admirable thing. But where's the ethics in the use of technology? Where is the ethics in facial recognition technology or artificial intelligence? We need to build more ethical frameworks into decisions around whether we will use it, when we will use it, and how we will use it. And I think we have to start saying just because we can doesn't mean we will. And we've seen this even just in the last month, because there's been a whole ruckus about the use of facial recognition technology in London, England, and around the installation of cameras and this equipment, and people were not told, walking along King's Cross Station, or what station was it they were going, and they're being recorded and they're not aware of this. Is that a reasonable thing to do? We have to ask the question, and we have to push for an answer. The other thing I talk about is the importance of the mediator. I say that the average person does not engage with evidence directly. I wish they would. I wish they'd go in and visit archives and use it, but they don't. Historians write histories. Journalists use evidence for information for writing their stories. Statisticians use evidence. I came across this story, and I want to tell it briefly. It was in an episode of National Public Radio, Hidden Brain, from December of 2018 by Shankar Vedantam. And he's talking about the impact of lost newspaper jobs on municipal finance. And he says, and I just read through because I've cut and pasted the whole section, the transcript, and I got to find, it says, there was a decline in the number of newspapers between 1996 and 2015. So researchers found the decline in newspapers, and they compared it to the increase in government borrowing costs. And what they found is when a newspaper closed, the cost of loans in that county went up. All across the country, the United States. The borrowing costs went up by 0.1%. So if you have a $65 million loan, the cost of borrowing will be $65,000 more because you've got that 0.1% increase. A loan of 10 years, that's $650,000 increase. The reason is there is no watchdog. There's nobody going to the municipal meetings. There's nobody going and holding the government to account and saying, what are you doing? Now, I take that a step further and I say, if they do not have the watchdog, they have no reason to keep the evidence. They're not going to keep the evidence. What do we need an archives for? Nobody's coming to ask for it. Nobody's coming to look at our records. What do we need it for? So we need historians. We need local history. We need journalists, which means we in society need to support them. We need to subscribe to local newspapers. We need to buy local history books. We need to go to local museum talks. We need to say this matters to me, because then the funders see it and they say, I guess, and they're not wishing to change. They're just not being held to account. They hold them to account, and I think most of them would say this is a good thing. So I talk about that in the book. But then I say, come on, guys, we need to educate. We need to raise awareness. One of the things I say at the beginning of the book was that South African President Thabo Mbeki was arguing in the 1990s that AIDS was not caused by a virus. And hundreds of thousands of people were dying because he was not implementing evidence-based measures to help people. The BBC reported on a study, a Uganda-Norway co-study in 2018 with 10,000 students in Kampala. So they were assessing, could they learn critical thinking skills? They said that within a very short training period, children as young as 10 could distinguish between the scientific basis for viruses like AIDS and local myths about the disease. They could get it. That episode is called You Can Handle the Truth. This is the page for that. This is the kind of initiative that I want the people, the public, to know about and to support. Teaching children, engaging with children, raising awareness, because they are our future. They are the ones who are going to go out and be the bosses of tomorrow. I have spent 30 years trying to tell bosses to get off your stick, and I thought, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to write the book. I'm going to tell everybody to go start teaching your children, and then I'm going to go dig in my garden. But before that, I'm going to go out and march. Now, I'm not a marcher. I'm not a protester. But the other thing the public needs to do is get mad. And they need to go out and say, we are mad. We don't like it. There was a march for science after Donald Trump was elected. I have called for a march for evidence. Amy Siskind, who is an activist in the United States, she's the author of The List, a week-by-week reckoning of Trump's first year. She is organizing a We the People march in Washington, D.C. on September 21st. I would never, 20 years ago, have advocated this because, my God, I'm too shy. I'm never going to be seen out there with a placard, right? But I did see a wonderful picture last year that said, it's so bad even introverts are marching. So in the 2 minutes before I wrap up, this is what I'm saying to the public. The other thing I say to the public is engage with the archives, go to the archives, go to the museums, go see the exhibits. And I think then to talk about the profession, what do? We have to work with integrity. Now, we can argue that there is no such thing as objectivity. We can argue about the difficulty of impartiality. I would say that we should strive to be impartial, just as a judge strives to be impartial and a doctor strives to be impartial. We have our biases, we have our opinions, but we have to set them aside in order to get the most complete, most authentic record we can. So that's our job. And in order to do that, we have to have integrity. We have to try to be accountable for our own actions and transparent. We have to minimize harm by our work, but also to try to seek that evidence and protect it wherever we can find it. So we need to keep when we can, collect when we can, advise, educate, and support others when we can. We can't be territorial. If somebody else wants to keep it and it's being kept, great. Let's not have those turf wars anymore. They were abundant when I started in the profession. They are marvelously diminished now, but they're still there. We need to raise awareness of the importance of evidence, and we need to be accountable for our actions, which means being transparent about all the decisions we make as record keepers. I end the book, and I end this talk with what I will say: we have been given a gift, and the gift is Donald Trump. We have an opportunity to see how things can be when what we call democratic societies, and I'm born in the United States, raised in Canada, raised to pledge allegiance to the flag, raised to believe in democracy, raised to believe in parliamentary strength. I am seeing it all fall apart. It makes me, my normal optimistic self is challenged right at the moment. We need to take that energy and say, we will act on it and we will change what we need to do in our profession in order to help society change. This is a quote from George Orwell. I resisted like anything putting George Orwell in my book because I thought, that's a cliche. We can't have this cliche, but my goodness, is he ever the best thing going for saying what we have to say. As he says here, when memory failed and written records were falsified, when that happened, the claim of the party to have improved the conditions of human life had got to be accepted, because there did not exist and never again could exist any standard by which it could be tested. Donald Trump tears up the records in his office and has fired record keepers on his watch. The Brexit decision, as we watched in the movie last night, was based on lies and manipulation of data and evidence in Facebook, Cambridge Analytica. If we want a democracy, we have to have a democracy, and that means following the rules and the rule of law. And evidence is essential to doing that, because evidence is what gives us the agreed basis of facts, of proof of facts, that allows us to come to an evidence-based truth. And we will not have that evidence-based truth. We will only have personal and partial truths if we do not protect the evidence. So when I say truth matters, facts matter, but evidence matters more. it is because I believe passionately that we cannot be a society of integrity if we do not have that evidence, however we choose to define it in our communities and societies. And having said all that, 2 minutes over. Now stand up and say, and I can't see any of you, so I'm not ignoring you if you raise your hand and I don't see it. Somebody help me. Does anybody want to challenge or question or argue or anything? I welcome it all. This is the first talk since the book is out, so it's the first time you've got the whole thing.
Thanks.
Oh, hey, that's better.
You talked about then how we're depending a lot on the third parties, the social media platforms to fact check and regulate themselves if we don't regulate them. But I'm just worried about that trend, and it's not just that they'll kind of exclude right-wing groups, but then exclude left-wing groups and environmental groups and a whole bunch of things I might want to see, right?
Yeah.
So, you know.
That it's an excellent question, and what I say in the book is what are we regulating? And I think we are not regulating content, except in as much as might apply to other laws like hate speech, things like that. We are regulating the concept of what is the platform for and what are the evidentiary requirements around it. And so I don't want to get into regulating content. But if we say you are not a neutral party, Facebook, you are not a neutral party. If you're a publisher, what does that mean? Do we define them as a publisher? Do we, and I think we can't, I don't think we do. I think we have to come up with a new concept for these platforms. But we have to stop calling them neutral. And we have to stop saying that they just are there and it's not their fault that people use it for that. You know, we have to say, no. There's got to be some accountability around here. Maybe one measure of accountability is that people who go on have to have a name and they cannot hide behind some anonymity. And then you say, well, people are afraid that might get targeted. Well, then this is the mire we're in, which is we are none of us anonymous anymore. And so do we hide behind fake names or do we use our real names? And what is the obligation of Facebook to say, what is my job in this? And what I'm worried about is that I'm not wanting them to keep people out. I'm wanting them, because other laws apply for hate speech and things like that. But I want them to say, I am not a neutral party in this game. I have skin in the game. Yeah. It's very dangerous territory. I mean, I only touch on it here. I can't go in this whole book on what do we do with this, but we need to have those conversations. Okay. I've stunned you all into silence. I'm sorry about that. Hi, yeah.
I just was wondering, opening some facts in your book, did you face any issue or problem?
About finding?
Yeah, about finding or whatever from the government or something.
No, and that, not yet. Book's out now. We'll see. The world can see the book. Now we'll see if I get in trouble. But what I will say is that I have come to terms with the fact that our profession is one that is very much bound by requirements that mean that the average archivist cannot speak out and cannot argue. You sign a confidentiality agreement and you're a civil servant and you work for an institution, there's only so much you can say. And I used to get so angry and say, come on guys, come on, we gotta get out there and do something. And they'd say, I can't say anything. And I said, okay, I will say it because I am beholden to no one. Oh, I'm beholden to my husband because he pays the bills. But he's pretty good. He's pretty good about that. So in some ways, writing the book was saying, I am fed up with fighting this fight. I am fed up with not being able to get there. And I know that my friends and colleagues cannot fight this fight themselves. I will do this. I will go out on a limb. Now, I am sure I'll get pushback from people. But I like to think that where I challenge actions, I have got the documentation in terms of what I could get, and that I never try to paint anybody except maybe Donald Trump in a really hostile light. I mean, I'm pretty mad at him right now. I actually had to hire an editor because I was so lost in the mire of my book by my anger that I had to get somebody to come and go through it and help me tone it down. Don't say that.
Despite your intentions to reach a general public, my fear is that this still becomes a conversation kind of within the archival echo chamber. And to your initial comment about the people in the room and who I see are the people likely to read the book. So what can we do to try and actually get this conversation more into the mainstream and get it out of the professional bubble?
Excellent question. So the first thing I did was I told the SAA, I love you, but you do not have the moxie to market this book. So we went to ALA, Neil Schumann, and said we need a bigger marketing push. I then said, this is not a book for the profession. They showed me their review list, and I said, the Children's Librarian's Journal does not need to see this one. I added a whole bunch of mainstream media people, including, okay, ego moment here, okay. The guy who wrote the foreword is friends, Lee McIntyre, who is lovely and has been a lovely supporter, is friends with Amy Siskin. And he said, send her a copy of the book. I sent her a copy of the book. He sent her, he said a tweet that said, if you like Amy Siskin's book, you'll like Laura's book. And she comes back with a tweet that says, read her book. Good luck with your book. She has 375,000 followers. If 2 of them read the book, I'll be happy. So I'm not in it for, you know, the royalties. I can afford my shoes. I get nice shoes. I like my shoes. I'm in it for the message. So my job, with the publisher's job, is to try to get this book out of our bubble. What I would say is if the profession can get it out of the bubble, people can say, this is a book I think a department should read, or we're going to do a workshop around this, or we're going to do something that gets people in to think about this so that they will read it and hope that the ideas trickle out, then that's what I would ask. And I would also say, we will have enormous disagreements in this book about how I portray the archivist, about the homogeneity that I present of we are all about this wonderful kumbaya moment of, you know, this is what we do. There are people who say, well, you didn't say this, you didn't say this, and you didn't say this. And I say, absolutely right. We can have that conversation under the cone of silence here. But when we go out to the world, we have got to look like we've got our act together. And then we better get our act together, which is when they say, what are you doing about bulk transfer of metadata when you transfer records? Because in the Millar report, this was a problem. We got to be ready with the answer, which means the educators need to be teaching the digital, need to be saying, I can equip you to go out and answer these questions, which are not archival. They're not information. They're not data. They're a whole suite of things. So we have to do a lot internally to be ready for that. Show a copy to your friends at the coffee bar. Say, look at the pretty typeface. Others.
I was struck that you said you couldn't always get primary sources, so you were using newspaper articles and things. And I wonder if you were also thinking about contexts where newspapers cannot be trusted to provide evidence.
To provide evidence, to be truthful?
Yeah, to be true.
To be truthful, yeah. I would, the newspaper I might choose to quote might have been the 12th I got to before I was confident in the story. And you will find that 2 newspapers stand out, the New York Times and the Washington Post. Now, we all know the New York Times is failing, right? They're failing because they're fake. But their reporting, what I could do is I could go to the New York Times. I could then access the evidence they used because they're very good at linking sources. I could then go read the original report or whatever document was the source because they might have that in their digital versions. I have a whole bunch of subscriptions to newspapers that I never had before I started this. I could then quote that reporter directly, or I could go and quote the newspaper version of it. I did as much as I absolutely could to get to an original source, bearing in mind that I was I was opening this Pandora's box of every morning I'd see something and I think, there's a story. And I would capture it in a file, digital file, and then I would sift through them. And I'd say, here's a story, and I can use this because I can get some verification of it. Here's a story, oh my God, that's explosive, but I can't get there, so I guess I can't use it. The Brazil fire, I dug deep into the story of the fire at the National Museum in Brazil. Bless my socks, I was reading Portuguese. Thank goodness for Google Translate, because the way to get at was to get into the Portuguese newspapers and the internal reports. So I was actually going in and trying to read the Portuguese and then translate it and say, can I actually extract something? Then if the original report told me what I needed and it was quoted in a secondary source, I would then go back to the secondary source and use that as my point of reference, because my audience is primarily North American. And I thought, I will take them to the most accessible source, secure in the knowledge that I've done as much as I can to have authentic and reliable facts at my hand.
But beyond, my point was not to question your integrity.
No. But it's a fascinating
But
research process.
Also this, like the process that you've gone through of this cross-referencing process, is it something that made sense to write about also? Because it's about finding truth, using multiple sources and cross-referencing. Are you talking about that process at all?
I talk about the concept of the more evidence we have, the more reliable, the more facts, the more truth. I talk about that. And I do talk about, I mean, the chapter where I talk about the inauguration ceremony is my example of, we start with this set of facts and it gives us this conclusion. And look, at the end of the chapter, say, guess what? We got a whole different set of facts and they give us a different conclusion. What I'm trying to do there is a teeny book, right? Afternoon over coffee, you have finished this book. I'm trying to paint pictures. So sometimes I don't go into that, and I've had to take out a lot of detail. I was given 55,000 words. I went to 62,000, and those who know me well know that I could write you a 50,000 email before I've had my porridge in the morning. So that was a struggle.
Laura, I'm wondering how you deal with the whole issue of the eclipse of an accepted definition of authority in mass society and developing societies. Because, I mean, you talk about being able to verify stuff through philosophy, through evidence, this sort of thing, but it seems to me that we've lost definitions of what is authoritative, like the eclipse of newspapers. No one trusts what politicians say. Reputable corporations are proven to be wrong. But we still have religion, you know. This is what gets me. Like, the United States is a very religious society, and people are either captured by dogmas or tribal narratives about what is true. So we've sort of imported historical relativism into the public sphere, you know, in terms of tribalized narratives.
Yes, and the chapter where I talk about concepts of truth and relative truth is the beginning of the book. I talk about personal truths, and that sometimes you just cannot shake anybody from their personal truth, which could be a religious truth. In terms of discussing religion outright, meet my 10-foot pole. I did not go there, right? I mean, that is a conversation that I will have over a beer, but will not go into in the book. But what I say is that there are personal truths that are unshakable, and they include religious and other and political truths. What I then talk about is that if you want this particular kind of truth, an evidence-based truth, you are already in the realm of science, which means that I am implicitly challenging, looking for the word, I am challenging beliefs that cannot be verified by science. But I'm not going after those in the abstract, because I'm only focusing on what I am concerned about, which is I'm going to make decisions in my life and my society and my government. How am I going to base that? And governments in the Western world are not based on religion. Now, that's changing, but they're based on evidence, and we need to go back to that. There's a whole discussion that was in the book and has kind of been pulled out about the role of the expert. And I do say we are experts. The record keepers are the experts. We're here. This is what we do. And you need to help us. But there is a whole conversation around the post-truth world, which is we don't need experts. We don't need people who know what we're doing. We know. And I talk about Andrew Wakefield and his anti-vaccine decisions, which were based on very bad scientific evidence. He had, I believe, 10 or 12 children that he studied, of which 6 didn't even meet the criteria for the study. And he came up with a declaration that the MMR vaccine caused autism. It is extremely bad science based on extremely bad evidence. And I talk about that. But a lot of stuff else I had to really pare down and say, if I want people to keep reading, this is where my Wendy, dear friend and editor, said, you won't keep people reading if you're so angry, because they'll think you're angry at them. And so I'm not angry at them. She said, well, then you got to step back here. You know, take that sentence out, you idiot. The boss gets to speak.
Okay. You know, I think that, you know, since you probably hadn't happened when you wrote the book, but of course, we all know about the hurricane that was going to hit Alabama, right?
Right.
So in a world where you have a president who uses his marker or whatever to show something that we all know is not true, and no one appears to care, except maybe the New York Times. And now...
And the Washington Post.
And the Washington Post, of course. And you know, we can laugh at that. But now, a couple weeks later, and we're hearing the U.S. say, oh, you know, it's Iran that attacked Saudi. So let's all go to war against them. So I guess my question is, you're not speaking to us, and we all care.
Yep.
But do people care? That man is going to get reelected. And I actually do remember Kennedy's death, but I also remember when we would care when a president blatantly lies.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, he wouldn't continue as the president. So does evidence really matter if we actually don't care what's the truth? Because why? We don't care whether the government's true. We want a government that's entertaining. And if that's our criteria, my sister works for the police department. It drives her crazy because many of her colleagues at work love Trump. And it doesn't matter what you say. Because they go, oh, everybody lies. Oh, you know. And I thought I grew in a world where you wanted an honest government. And they want to entertain them. And so I guess my question is, do you think you can make archives matter? Or do you think we can get people to think about it?
Who's buying the beer?
People are going on your march. Other than I.
I am going to be 60 years old on Sunday. Happy birthday to me. And I care.
I care.
But what upsets me is my naivete, which is I thought we'd fought this fight. I thought we'd won this fight. I thought this fight was over. And I'm talking about things like women's rights. I didn't have to fight that fight. My mother did it. You know, I could just go to work and be who I wanted to be and run my own business and not have kids if I didn't feel like it. I could do that because people of my mother's generation had fought the fight. Well done, them. Thanks, Mom. I have to fight that fight again. And I don't want to have to fight that fight again. We should not be in a world where we have to fight against racism. I lived in the United States in that, and I thought we had gotten there because I'm naive and I'm idealistic and I want the best world possible. So we have to keep fighting, and it is perpetual. It is Thomas Jefferson's eternal vigilance, which is probably misquoted. I don't know. Have to look it up. We absolutely need evidence because these are the most perilous times of all. And the only people left caring are the people like us. If we're the only ones left, then we have to hold on for dear life and make it happen, because it's the only way we will be there protecting it when the tide turns and people say, where did the evidence go? So I've written this to get more people to care, because I want more people. We can't do it ourselves. And I say in the book, we simply cannot do this ourselves. You're asking too much of us. And what I try to say to the public is, you need to understand what's involved in this process, and you need to understand that in a digital age, we cannot wait. It's not old, it's not static, it's not physical in a back room. You have to be part of this solution. Help us, be part, come with us, come to our exhibits, come to our archives. We want you there. So I think we just have to keep fighting and fighting and fighting. And someday I truly believe that Trump is a gift, because I think that people will then say, I was naive, I didn't think this would happen, it happened. We have to do something to stop it and correct it and not let it happen again. And maybe this is a hugely transformative moment. And it's not just south of the border. This is what's happening in the UK, which is there's a complete disregard for law and the rule of law. It's happening in Venezuela. It's happening in Hungary. It's happening in Canada, dare I say it, when people say there is no reason that we should have to worry about the rule of law and what we have asked our Attorney General to do. And to be impartial in the face of political pressure. And where's the evidence of that? I mean, we have a recording that people would say should never have been made of a telephone conversation, but boy, we sure learned a lot out of that telephone conversation. Right? So we got everybody being a record keeper these days. So maybe we need that. And maybe the tide will turn, but not if we all say, too late, not on my watch, which is why you, my friend, who remember Kennedy's assassination better than I do, and I need to take our 60-plus-year-old bodies out for a drink and say to you, you have got to take up the mantle, because we have been fighting for 35 years, quietly behind the scenes, and now I'm trying to fight in public, which is going to get me in deep trouble somewhere along the line. I know that. But I'm okay with that, because my husband has a pension and he's got a different last name. So
when you're talking about this, that focusing on recorded evidence might in some ways kind of further entrench injustice? You know, there could be many examples of this. I recently read this New Yorker article about how Black families in the US, there's a really large number of people who don't have the legal title to their land, like because of historical injustice. And it's really easy for developers to work loopholes and take that land from them. They have the evidence that says that's their land, but what's true is that people know it's their land and their grandparents' land. That's truth also. Do you think that having proper documentation and following like colonial laws is kind of injustice?
I actually go quite against that in the book by a whole chapter that talks about the different forms of evidence. And I say it is a social construct. Every society decides for itself what it defines as evidence, and then it puts the structures in place to manage it. And what we have to do is address up front those conflicts or overlaps. And I also talk about the silences and gaps in records. And I say there is a whole dearth of information about women in history, because women were not allowed to own property, so there's no records of them owning property, so they don't exist in the records, so we can't find out about them. I talk about the records of slavery and the databases that are used to accumulate this and the sources that this comes from, which include ship's logs and things like this. And I say, these are ways that we learn about people. I said, what if you weren't considered people, you were considered property, right? So I talk about the different ways in which that would be recorded or not recorded. It is then up to the reader, I hope, to see in that what matters to them and recognize that they can define evidence however they want. What I want them to do is understand that there is a way of proving something so that you can carry that proof forward in time and space. I want them to be able to prove it and then to treasure that piece of proof, however they define it. It could be a song or a story or an oral tradition. But one of the things I talk about is the independent assessment process, IAP, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how there was a decision made, and I'm going to get my facts wrong because I don't have the notes in front of me, that people's testimony for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was considered private, and a judge said, Canadian judge said, we will only keep it for 15 years, and then if no one comes forward to say they want to keep it, they will destroy it, in order to respect personal privacy of the people who testified about their experience as residential school, people in residential schools. And what I say at the end of that little discussion is, it is cruelly ironic to me that if people's testimony of their experiences, which has now been recorded in what we would consider to be a traditional Western form by having a transcript or an audio recording, if they are not there to say, I want to keep it, and it is destroyed, then we are left only with the record of the people who were in charge of that process, not the record of the people who were affected by that process. And the decision, judge's decision, respects their privacy by saying, if you're not there to choose otherwise, we will destroy it. But then we've lost that voice. So I am uncomfortable with that decision. I can see the rationale behind it. But what I want is for people to read that and say, what are the stories that I have in my family that are not captured? What are the events or ideas or experiences or evidentiary issues, if I may, that I need to capture somehow? And how do I do that? And then what has to happen, I think, is for archives and museums and libraries and galleries, who are all looking after evidence in different ways and different forms for different reasons, to recognize the commonalities, which say, we may have archaeological evidence and you may have documentary evidence. I'm only writing about recorded evidence primarily. But there's a whole other world out there, and how do we make sure that we are working together so that if we don't have it, I don't want to see Kipu, the digital equivalent of a Kipu, be showing up 100 years from now and nobody knowing what the heck it is, because we haven't figured it out. We haven't documented that this is what it is. If somebody wants to keep an oral tradition, make sure we know how to get into it. You probably want me to be quiet now, right?
I think
That's possible.
It's actually time, because at 6:30 we have another class, and I just want to say, but maybe that Laura will stay for a few minutes. I want to say that it is absolutely truthful. We all enjoyed, and that we all have the evidence of our memory of this amazing talk, though we didn't record
Evidence.
it.
Yeah.
Oh, evidence that we do. And oh, look at that. We've even created a more formal record. Let's hope we preserve it. And we'll have a very small thank you gift for what is a wonderful talk and archive matter. And those who want to stay, maybe Laura will wait a little bit before she goes to that room.
Yeah.
Really good.